Thank you so much, Elena. It's been my pleasure, my honor to be here. We have a video that's coming up. Every time I watch that video, I just get chills up and down my spine. It's pure hate, and it's very frightening. I've really been looking forward to talking with you this evening, albeit about such a seriously disturbing topic. As I was thinking about this awful construct of hate, I wanted to understand where it comes from and how different religious cultures and disciplines think about it. I first explored the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I'll then explore Hinduism and Buddhism. I'm fortunate that I can talk to one of my favorite cousins, Rabbi Mark Weiner, about Judaism. He opened up our conversation in explaining that in Judaism, there's the concept of Yetzer Hara, which is similar to the Christian concept of a sin nature and is a natural part of God's creation. So how do we manage our evil, hateful tendencies, I ask? My cousin explains, well, it's complicated. In Judaism, we believe in the struggle between Yetzer Hara and the tendency to good, or Yetzer Hatov. People are able to create, do business, and run democratic governments. We believe that without the manifestations of competition, jealousy, greed, sexuality, and anger, we would not have the energy to live full lives. Yet if the Yetzer Hara is allowed to flourish without constraint, the excess of these forces becomes dangerous, giving rise to what we just saw, crime and fraud and war and inequity and injustice. Because the ancient rabbis teach us that we are neither good nor evil, but rather that both a Yetzer Hatov and a Yetzer Hara exists in everyone. Rabbi Josh Franklin in a 2013 paper discusses the interesting case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As we all know, Robert Louis Stevenson separated these two life forces into the monster Mr. Hyde and the feeble wimp, as he calls it, Dr. Jekyll. Neither character is fully human. Concurring with the ancient rabbis, Rabbi Franklin writes, quote, living a purposeful and meaningful life requires that we are driven by a healthy balance between both our moral and primal natures. In thinking about the relationship between good and evil and an afterlife, my cousin Mark notes that there's ambiguity in Judaism. Classic rabbinic scholars share the view that this existence entails an extremely heightened understanding of and a connection to the divine presence. Most Jews don't often think about this concept. So to discuss the Christian conception of good and evil, I decided to consult one of my best friends from college, a wonderfully charming and smart corporate consultant, Mara. Christian thought, Mara told me, about original sin and free will has evolved through the centuries. An early pope and authoritative theologian, Augustine of Hippo, in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, taught that Adam's sin is transmitted by concupiscence, or a, quote, hurtful desire, resulting in humanity becoming a massa damnata, or mass of perdition, a condemned crowd, with a weakened, though not destroyed, freedom of will. When Adam sinned, human nature was thenceforth transformed. Augustine believed that prior to the fall, Adam had both the freedom to sin and not to sin, posse peccare, posse non peccare. But humans have no freedom to choose not to sin, non posse non peccare, after Adam's fall. Theologian Pelagius, about 100 years later than Augustine in the late 5th century and early 6th century, reacted negatively to Augustine's theory of original sin, Mara reminded me. Pelagius believed that it would be an insult to God if humans were to be born inherently sinful or biased towards sin. Pelagius believed that the soul was created by God at conception, therefore it couldn't be swaddled by sin. Pelagius argued that sin was spread through example rather than through hereditary transmission. Moreover, Pelagius believed that since adults were baptized and cleansed of their sin, their children were not capable of inheriting a sin that the parents did not have. Then, making kind of a frowning expression, Mara informed me, well, John Calvin believed that original sin seemed to be a hereditary depravity and corruption of our nature spread throughout the soul, making all humans liable to God's wrath. The activities that come from this depraved nature include adulteries, thefts, hatreds, murders, carousing, quote, the fruits of sin. And then, because I was interested in the Christian conception of the afterlife, I posed a question to Mara about that. She told me that the death of Jesus and his resurrection were part of God's plan for redemption. Jesus' sacrifice was a victory over sin as well as death. While physical death still happens, Christians who believe in Christ and live good lives will be given eternal life in heaven. Mara then summarized modern theological Christian thought for me by discussing Soren Kierkegaard, Paul Tillich, and Reinhold Niebuhr. For them, the doctrine of original sin is not necessarily linked to some act of disobedience by the first human beings. Instead, the fall describes every human person's existential situation. For the theologian Locke, God is not the first cause of evil. Instead, he wrote, individuals who freely choose evil are the first causes of evil. After understanding that Christian thought tries to explain how human beings have to wrestle with the impulse to sin, as well as the struggle to know how to exercise free will, my next interview would be with my neighbor, Farida, who might be able to delve into the Quran with me. Farida explained to me that Islam teaches that doing good things and staying away from evil is a means of getting close to God. Islamic belief is that people are influenced by a number of forces in making choices between good and evil. People are naturally inclined to do good. God's mercy and love guide people toward good. However, two enemies work constantly against people to force them into evil. These enemies are Satan and one's ego or carnal self. Islam teaches that Satan himself has no power to create. There's no war between Satan and God. Satan's only power is the ability to whisper into people's souls and try to misguide them. He whispers to prevent people from doing good, or at least to delay it. As with the other faiths, I asked Farida about the Islamic conception of an afterlife. Is there a relationship between the battle between good and evil and an afterlife? First of all, Farida told me this life is viewed as a test in Islam. The test is a struggle of choosing good over Satan and the carnal self. The test reveals the outcome to ourselves and helps us grow in the process. If we stay constantly active in good pursuits, it's easier for us to become closer to God. If inactive, Satan and the carnal self have more opportunity to misguide us. Farida continued saying that the main method in Islam for resisting Satan is prayer and refuge in God. Without God's permission, Satan cannot cause any harm. A person who takes refuge in God, asks for help from him with an open heart, will be immune to Satan's evil whispers. People perform several good deeds in the course of their life, enter Jannah, paradise, where there's no pain, sickness, or sadness. For those who perform evil deeds, they enter Jahannam, or hell, where they endure both physical and spiritual suffering. Farah continued, Allah is a forgiving and compassionate God. Muslims believe that not all bad actions or decisions are punishable. Allah will forgive those who regret their actions and have performed certain good deeds in their lifetime. There's so much that's in common for all of us in Islam and Christianity and Judaism, the Abrahamic religions, the Abrahamic religions. And then I sought out my friend Anaisha to try to understand the concepts of good and evil in Hinduism. What she told me is that Hinduism has a non-theist tradition that does not have the construct of the existence of an almighty, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. Therefore, the classic formulation of the struggle between good and evil does not apply to most Hindu traditions. Evil as well as good, however, along with suffering, is considered real and caused by human free will. Both evil and suffering is extensively discussed in ancient and medieval Hindu texts. But neither good nor evil, neither bliss nor suffering are linked to gods or one God, but considered a part of the innate nature of living in the cycle of rebirths. Some suffering is self-caused intentionally or from ignorance, some suffering is caused by others, and some suffering is caused by natural forces, aging, disease, or natural disasters. Anish explained that Hinduism and other Indian religions focus on the path to spiritual liberation called moksha. As people achieve a higher level of spiritual goodness in their present life, they experience peace and happiness, not impeded by evil and suffering. They also come closer to moksha. Achieving moksha, spiritual liberation, results in an end to the cycle of rebirths. To understand the Buddhist conception of good and evil, I sought out my colleague Mark. Mark looked at me rather quizzically. He said, well, like Hinduism, Buddhism does not have a monotheistic belief system in which the eternal struggle between good and evil is connected to omniscient, omnibenevolent God. In cultures with Buddhist spiritual influence, both good and evil is perceived as part of an antagonistic duality that must be overcome through achieving sunyata, or emptiness, also known as a state of pure consciousness. Achieving oneness in Buddhism is the ideal. So, interesting. We have an initial understanding of how the 5 major religions view these constructs of good and evil in our lives. There's generally a religious directive to integrate and subdue these evil forces contained in our spirit. Yet, as we well know, religious fervor often ignites hate, and today we're confronted by a tsunami of hate. Dr. Izzeldin Abuleish, a 5-time Nobel Prize nominee, a Palestinian Gazan obstetrician, and now Palestinian-Canadian public health expert, author of the book I Shall Not Hate, has written, quote, "Hatred is a pressing global public health issue and a destructive, contagious disease manifested in violence, extremism, and fundamentalism. Hatred is a rapidly growing epidemic and virulent public health threat. Hate crimes have been designated a public health issue by the American College of Physicians. The last several years have seen an increase in discrimination, particularly regarding immigration, an increase in violent racist incidents, a sharp rise in anti-Muslim violence, and record levels of anti-Semitic incidents. Hatred affects the structure and functions of heart, brain, immune system, and causes malfunctioning, morbidity, and mortality. There's a diminished trust in government due to abuses of power, illegal surveillance, false flag operations, and other paranoid theories, often having an origin in internet abuse and internet hate. Survey-based research demonstrates that people who have exposure to online hate are more likely to express greater levels of mistrust and hostility toward the U.S. government. Hate, Dr. Abuleish says, is a disease. And just like other diseases, hatred does not only spread horizontally, but vertically, transgenerationally. Hostility increases the risk of developing heart disease and worsens heart disease in those who already have it. Research shows that heart failure patients with high anger and hostility scores also have far more hospitalizations. Studies have demonstrated that anger and temper flares are significantly associated with accelerated genetic aging, even with an increased risk of death from all causes, end quote. Franz Boas, a German Jewish anthropologist who had escaped from Germany in the 1930s, became one of the, quote, intellectual pillars of modernity, according to Wade Davis in his February 2021 piece, Why Anthropology Matters, published in Scientific American. Davis wrote, quote, "Anthropology is the antidote to nativism, the enemy of hate, a vaccine of understanding, tolerance, and compassion that can counter the rhetoric of demagogues." Boas railed against the cruel conceits and stupidity of scientific racism. Inspired by his time among the Inuit on Baffin Island and later the Kwak-Waka-Wak in the salmon forests of the Pacific Northwest, he informed all who would listen that the other peoples of the world were not failed attempts to be them, failed attempts to be modern. Every culture was a unique expression of the human imagination and heart. Each was a unique answer to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? When asked that question, humanity responds in 7,000 different languages, voices that collectively comprise our repertoire for dealing with all the challenges that will confront us as a species, end quote. From a social, psychological, and sociological perspective, the inception of hate begins early in life. Its adherents learn hate and bigotry and perhaps violence as children. Some of those who hate are subjected to highly rigid and punitive parenting. Others thrive on their love for power. Some find a sense of belonging in the movements that embody hate toward other groups. Some get caught up in the excitement of a social movement. Some hearken back to centuries-old conspiracy theories. Social media amplifies and exponentially increases these messages of hate. What perhaps is most abhorrent is the hate that we see in our schools and on our college campuses. We had seen this hate before when African American children were entering for the first time previously all-white schools in the South. Many of us in my generation never thought that we would see that again. Dara Horn, in her recent article in the Atlantic magazine, Why the Most Educated People in America Fall for Anti-Semitic Lies, wrote, quote, "Among the mountains of evidence that Jewish students sent me, one image has stayed in my mind. There are videos of crowds chanting, 'Long live the Intifada,' inside Harvard Science Center." And then the statement, the cry, the chant, "There's only one solution, Intifada revolution," in Harvard Yard. And then Horn goes on to say, "My Harvard classmates 20 years ago and I often disagreed about the most important things, but no one screamed in our faces when we wore Hebrew t-shirts on campus. No one shunned us when we talked about our friends and family in Israel or spat on us on our way to class. No crowds gathered to chant for our deaths. No one told us that there should be no more Jews." End quote. Cynthia Miller Idris, in her book Hate in the Homeland, delineates hate into 4 categories. 1, anti-government and anti-democratic practices and ideals. 2, exclusionary beliefs. 3, existential threats and conspiracies. And 4, apocalyptic fantasies. What can we as psychologists do about this era's contagion of hate? As Isabel Wilkerson noted in her book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, Albert Einstein, when he arrived in Princeton in December 1932, was so horrified by the hate directed at African Americans that he determined that he would publicly speak out about the injustices from which he had escaped in Nazi Germany and the injustices that he was then observing in the United States. He co-chaired a committee to end lynching. He joined the NAACP. He spoke out on behalf of civil rights activists. And then Wilkerson wrote in Caste, quote, "In a world without caste, being male or female, light or dark, immigrant or native born, would have no bearing on what anyone was perceived as being capable of. In a world without caste, we would all be invested in the well-being of others in our species, if only for our own survival, and recognize that we are in need of one another more than we have led to believe. We would join forces with indigenous people around the world, raising the alarm as fires rage and glaciers melt. We would see that when others suffer, the collective human body is set back from the progression of our species." End quote. Having been a student of psychologist Hobart Orich Maurer at the University of Illinois and having read his books and articles on the importance of community, I strongly believe that forming community is an antidote to hate. Community can give those of us who often feel isolated by the stressful encounters with prejudice, microaggressions, social rejection, persecution, harassment, and an apathy among some in our social group, can give us a sense of comfort, connection, and being understood. For those of us in the prescriptive authority movement, battling the harassment, denigration, and rejections from many different professional quarters, we formed both formal and informal professional groups statewide, regionally, nationally, and internationally that serve as our base for continued advocacy in the legislature and the media, with community supporters, including social service agencies, consumer-based mental health organizations like NAMI, academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, religious institutions, and other professional groups like attorneys, social workers, teachers, nurses, physician assistants, physicians, and others. We have sponsored biannual dinner networking events and other social informational events supporting our journey to become prescribing psychologists and effective advocates. For those of us who have formed the Association of Jewish Psychologists in response to our current tidal wave of anti-Semitism, we find a strong sense of community in working with each other and in creating alliances with other professionals, as well as forums for discussion, advocacy, and the arts. So we've created a directory of clinicians who have made themselves available to treat community members requesting a Jewish therapist. We've recruited psychologists to facilitate our support groups. These include university students, parents, and faculty, high school students and their parents, practicing psychologists, professionals in other academic disciplines, including economics, animal ecology, anthropology, retired professionals, older adults, Israeli community members in the United States, and we have partnered with the Israeli Psychological Association to work with Israeli citizens in Israel. And we have created partnerships with so many other groups, including the APA, APF, the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League. Dr. Tara Lieberman is a director of the ADL and a director with AJP, and has created opportunities for us to work closely with ADL. On this last Monday, February 26th, Dr. Tara Lieberman, Dr. Cassie Feldman, Rabbi Ron Fish, and I did a webinar in which we talked about the psychological effects of anti-Semitism, how to manage symptoms and reach out for care in the community. The ADL has created the world's largest summit on anti-Semitism and hate, Never Is Now, next week in New York City, addressing the community's need for information and need for support. Drs. Tara Lieberman, Cassie Feldman, Lou Steinberg, and I and others will be providing support for conference participants at the conference, and our webinar will be shown again at this conference. We've also partnered with other groups, including Blue Star Families, an online community for military and veteran families. We're going to be talking with TAPS, the Tragedy Assistance Program for Military Family Survivors, and we work closely with International Hillel. And we have been working, Dr. Steve Stein and Dr. Tara Lieberman have been working to collect hard data on the stress symptoms of Jewish college students as they are confronted with anti-Semitism. We're working with a group of Jewish alumni, students, and parents of Brown University. We're working with Princeton University Center for Jewish Life. We're working with an organization named Sharaka, which means partnership in Arabic. It's an organization that includes Israelis and Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, and Druze from around the Middle East working together in partnership to implement the Abraham Accords. We're working with the Shalom Hartman Institute. Dr. Eileen Serlin has been very much involved, and she and her husband Jeff have been very much involved with the Shalom Hartman Center for many years. It's a leading center of Jewish thought and education, serving Israel and North America. And then we are connected with the Institute for Peace, whose CEO is Eldin Abouleish. It's an aspirational institute right now to be built in Israel, he hopes, dedicated to eradicating hate. And then we're connected to Zaka, a UN-recognized humanitarian volunteer organization that provides a rapid response to mass casualties of disasters across the world. To date, Zaka has saved thousands of lives and honored those who couldn't be saved with dignity and death. We're also connected through Dr. Eileen Serlin with Steve Olweon in the Common Bond Institute that has operated humanitarian programs to facilitate local capacity building for psychosocial healing and conflict transformation in regions of war and turmoil, and has engaged compassionate dialogue across divides. And we're connected with IPSI, this Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. IPSI is dedicated to strengthening the relationships between African Americans and the nation of Israel. And the Women's Collective, Muslim and Jewish Women United, working together to combat hate and form solidarity in the United States. And Chai Village has reached out to us, the first synagogue-based village in the country that provides community for older adults. And AJP is publishing a newsletter called Schmooze that reports on AJP research and the work of all of our other committees. It also publishes personal stories. Dr. Stephen Stein is our editor. AJP is putting together a journal, Kesher, meaning connection. Daniel Burston is the editor-in-chief and looks forward to publishing scientific articles, profiles of erudite psychologists, articles about Jewish culture and the arts. AJP will be sponsoring a series of webinars, and I've been working with Dr. S.D. Cole on that, and that's very exciting for all of us. 2 have already been scheduled, and a 3rd will be scheduled soon. The first one is going to be March 26th at 8 p.m. Professor Susanna Heschel, an American scholar, professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, the daughter of Joshua Heschel, and Tariq El-Assis, the James Wright Professor and Chair of Middle Eastern Studies at Dartmouth College, will chair a webinar discussion on the crisis in the Middle East, mirroring what they have done for nearly a decade at Dartmouth College. Drs. Heschel and El-Assis have received worldwide attention for their scholarly and even-handed approach to discussing the history, conflicts, and politics of the Middle East. And then on May 8th, Professor David Raskin, the Mohn Family Professor of Contemporary Art History at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, will be giving a lecture on the art and Jewish symbolism of Chagall, reflecting on the similarities and differences between the anti-Semitism of Chagall's era of the 1930s and 40s and our own. The lecture will be live streamed. In the summer of 2024, a staged reading of an original play by an AJP psychologist and playwright, Henry Greenspan, called The Death or Play of the Mad jester of the Warsaw Ghetto. We are talking about live streaming it as well. So these are just some of the things that we're doing, and I hope to give you thoughts about how you also can partner with your with neighbors, with friends, with colleagues around the world to form community for us to be able to combat the hate that we're seeing all around us. Thousands of words of print have been written about the explosion of hate in our era. We must be engaged in this struggle for Yetzer Tov, for the good to overcome the evil, for us to fight back the evil in ourselves and the evil that we currently see in our world.